I hadn't heard my sister's voice in over a month. Now, for some siblings, that might have been fairly typical. Not us. Like clockwork, every Saturday night, she would call me up. We'd talk about whatever was going on in our lives, her job, my school, her artwork, my failed relationships, every Saturday night for 2 years. And then one Saturday, she didn't call. And she didn't answer any of mine. I figured maybe she lost track of time, so I sent her a text. I got a short response. Sorry, I'm busy. We'll talk later. Later never came. All of my calls, no answer. Texts, just short, dismissive replies. She called me a few days later in the middle of the night and left a message telling me that she was fine, but that she might not be able to talk for a bit. She told me not to worry. I got worried. I wanted to check up on her, but didn't know any friends she had in the city, didn't have anyone to reach. She had packed up for New York to get away from bad life choices, moved over 1,500 miles away, and I didn't know a soul I could call to see if she was okay. Before, that didn't worry me. She always called. Always. I call Sarah my sister, but she wasn't, really. We're cousins, and my parents died when I was young in a car accident. My uncle, her dad, took me in. When I was 16 and Sarah was 19, Uncle Eric passed away suddenly from a heart attack. The only family we had left was each other, and she became my guardian, taking care of me. She did her best, but I think the stress of it made her make some really bad choices. I never got solid answers, but after I went off to college, she sold our house, split the money with me, and moved to New York. She said she just needed to start fresh, away from things, and that after college, if I wanted, she'd find us a place where we could stay together. Until then, she was keeping costs low and just enjoying living a sort of bohemian lifestyle. Now, part of keeping costs low was that she was roughing it in what she kindly described as a shithole. It was some one-bedroom, one-bath apartment in an old rundown building that seemed half empty. I always was sort of worried about her being there alone, but she enjoyed the place in a romanticized sort of way. I'm not sure if her insisting on the building's abundant character was to keep my worries in check or just to help convince herself, but for whatever reason, that shithole of hers meant something to Sarah. I couldn't see it. I'd never come to visit Sarah in the year she'd been out in the big city. I'd made some friends at school, and they'd asked me to stay over winter break. Sarah said that her place was too small and cramped for me to be able to enjoy myself anyway, and that we'd do something over the summer, get away somewhere. Summer was here. Hopefully Sarah would be too. I'd wanted to head out to New York as soon as I lost contact with her. She was my only family after all, and after everything she'd done for me, the least I could do was drop everything and rush to her rescue at the first sign of trouble. My friends convinced me that she was probably fine, that she'd left that message and that she was still texting, that something was going on, but that I needed to make sure I finished up the semester so that everything I'd been working towards wasn't completely wasted. I hated every second of it, and my grades definitely suffered a bit, but I was able to close out the semester and had a flight booked for the very next day. She'd sent me the name of her apartment right after moving in, so finding the building was pretty easy. Thank God for modern technology. A small sign marked by the name Settlers Rest was set above the front entrance to the old building. I didn't know architecture, but the building looked a bit older than most of the more modern buildings around it. It was built of painted white brick, or at least had a false brick exterior, and stretched up for what looked to be 6 stories. It seemed to be the shortest building on the block, with most of the street being dominated by towers of various extreme heights. The age and stark contrast with the city around it wasn't a surprise to me. I'd expected as much. What threw me off the most was that the Settlers Rest seemed well maintained. Based on the way Sarah had spoken of the place, I had expected it to be consumed by age and rot, but instead the old brick building seemed almost dignified. Still, it was just another building in a city far too full of them, and I'm sure I would have walked right by it if I didn't know what I was looking for. I opened the double doors that led to a small lobby, and I mean small. A single couch sat on the wall to my right, an old floral thing that likely had sat there for decades, flanked on either side by a pair of small metal end tables that looked like they had been welded together from scrap metal. A small TV, an old CRT, was fashioned up in the corner of the room, though its placement seemed awkward at best considering how anyone sitting in the couch would need to crane their necks up and to the right just to get a look at what was going on. At the moment, all it played were silent commercials. Off to the side of the TV was a vending machine, though most every single space was empty. Either the machine was extremely popular, or someone had long since given up on getting it refilled. I was fairly certain it wasn't the former. The only other thing of note in the lobby was a small window, with curtains pulled closed on either side. Fastened to the wall below it was a shelf with an old bell and a pen, connected to the nearby wall by a string. I set my suitcase down on the couch. I figured that this window was my best chance to get in touch with somebody. I rang the bell once, waited a good dozen seconds, and then rang it again. There wasn't a sign telling a person to ring, but it just felt like the best way to get someone's attention. Down the hall, which led deeper into the building, I could see a door pressed into the same wall as the window. It seemed the only way to get inside to wherever the window led. Likely an office? That made the most sense. But in a building this old, maybe nobody used the office anymore? Or they didn't care enough to answer visitors. I rang the bell a third time. A door opened from down the hall, but not the one I had been expecting. The hallway itself stretched down deeper into the complex, with 2 doors on each wall. At the end was what could only be an elevator, with another door right next to it that I guessed had to be the stairs. The door that had opened was the second on the right, and after a moment an older woman peeked her head out into the doorway. "I'm afraid nobody is going to answer that bell." I was struck by a momentary wave of heat rushing to my face, but pushed back the beginnings of embarrassment. Nothing to be embarrassed about. It was an obvious mistake, and the woman didn't seem to be annoyed. If anything, her tone suggested a bit of amusement. Probably a semi-common mistake. "Don't worry, dear. Visitors do that all the time, when visitors come, but the manager doesn't usually bother staying in the office. A great deal more to do elsewhere," he would say. "A great more important things to do anywhere but there." I slid a few feet to the side to grab my suitcase again, never turning my attention away from the older woman. Sorry about that. I didn't know." "How could you, dear?" She wasn't exactly wrong. I made my way down the hallway closer to the woman, my feet clacking against the hardwood floor as I closed the distance between us. Well, where would I be able to find the manager then? The woman hadn't left the threshold of her apartment, but she had swung her door most of the way open and waited for me as I approached her. Now that I was closer, I could see that she was actually even older than she seemed from a distance. Her eyes were slightly sunken in, and they seemed to be mostly black, with brown flecking through when it caught the light from the hallway just right. Her hair was completely gray and tied back and out of her face, though it seemed more from practicality than style, as it just bunched and curled whichever way it wanted after escaping from the hair tie. If I had to guess an age, I'd say 70s, but I was always infamously bad at that sort of thing. However old, though, she wore the lines upon her face with a smile, and that meant a lot more to me than anything else. She heard my question and looked past me to the door directly across from her own. I turned as well and saw a small plaque that said "Manager" embossed into the dark brown wood. Ah, the door next to the office. That seems a good place to start, I guess. I turned back to her after speaking, intent on thanking her for her help, when I saw her expression. It wasn't quite the same smile, though her lips curled up and her eyes glistened. It was a bit smaller. "Are you looking for a room, or looking for a person?" I paused for a moment. The woman stared directly into my eyes, not breaking contact except to blink. My heart seemed to thump a single time with force inside my chest. And then it was back to normal. I noticed I was digging my fingernails into my palm on my left hand and released the tension. I closed my eyes for a moment. Why was I suddenly uncomfortable? It was a simple question. Why was I suddenly so worried? Sorry, a person. My sister. Her smile returned in full. "Oh, good. Then you needn't bother the manager at all. There isn't a person here who could come or go without me knowing, and I must confess I've become a bit of a busybody these days. I know every tenant, every room, every schedule. There isn't very much to do to pass the time, you see." I took a closer look at the woman standing in front of me. 70s, gray hair, black eyes. But between all of those features, between all of her words, I got the feeling that she was toying with me somehow. Not that I didn't believe her, I did. Most people wouldn't confess to spying on their neighbors to a stranger if they weren't serious. Then again, most people wouldn't confess that at all. But no, the woman meant more than she said. Or maybe Sarah's disappearance just had me jumping. Oh, well then maybe you know my sister, Sarah Kessel. Brown hair, brown eyes, she should be... I trailed off as soon as the woman's focus did. After I'd started speaking, her eyes floated down to the floor and she took a small step backwards. The woman noticed my silence, noticed that I had noticed her, and returned to my gaze. Yes, Sarah. She's moved out, dear. Sorry. She gave a soft, weak smile, and then began reaching for the door. I stepped forward, less than a foot away from the woman, and grabbed on tight to the doorframe. What do you mean she's moved out? I studied the woman, her expression. Her shoulders were now pushed forward and her head tilted downward. My hand was now preventing her from closing her door, and she seemed to retreat into herself, slouching down. I towered over her now, though she hadn't felt half as small a moment earlier. The old woman didn't answer me, and instead just turned to look at my left hand, gripping tight onto the frame. Her door wavered for a moment, and she looked quickly from my hand back to my face. I pulled my hand back just in time as her door slammed shut. What the hell, lady? You almost crushed my hand! I did everything I could not to scream at the closed door in front of me, and instead kept my tone to simply forceful. I knocked on her door, though it was definitely closer to a bang, with my open palm. I can't help you. Like I said, she's moved out. There's nothing for you here. The woman's voice was muffled by more than just the wood that separated us. There was a waver and a strain to her words. She knew something. She knew something about what was going on with Sarah. Please, I'm just looking for my sister. I need to talk to her. I haven't been able to reach her in over a month. I banged on her door again, just twice, as an exclamation. If you know what happened to her, please, I need to find her. She's my only family left, and I'm not leaving until I can talk to her. There was a long silence that hung between us. I wanted to kick the door again and again until it cracked and collapsed in upon itself. I flashed with anger, and then I breathed deeply. My head softly connected with the wood in front of me, and I let my weight drift forward with it. I leaned hard against the doorframe, collapsing into it. Weeks of tension and concern built up after being pushed deeper and deeper downward, eventually bubbled up back up to the floor. So much fear that it felt like it would explode. And yet when I let it go, it escaped in a single word, softly spoken. Please. Seconds passed by. I thought for a moment that the woman had merely walked away, but I knew in my gut that she was still standing there. I could feel how close she was, that if this door wasn't there to hold me up, I would simply collapse onto her. What was going on? Where was Sarah? Why was any of this happening? I don't know how, but I felt as if a hand reached out and caressed the side of my face, or at least the warmth of one had. I suddenly pulled back and looked up at the door, still closed and separating me from the old woman. And then the doorknob turned, and it opened just a crack. Room 406. That's where your sister lived. Nobody else has moved in since. Maybe you'll find something there. I rode the elevator in complete silence. My right thumb trailed along the handle to my suitcase, feeling the coarse texture of its fabric. I needed something to ground me. The elevator, more than the rest of this building, betrayed the age of the Settler's Rest. I didn't see a placard saying it was up to code, and I doubted it would have passed if inspected. I could feel the wobble of the cables, and could hear the echo of the elevator shaft just outside the metal box that was taking me up. I felt unsafe there. When the doors finally opened and I stepped out onto the 4th floor, I didn't feel any safer. The 4th floor hallway finally matched my initial expectation of the building. The carpet that stretched along the floor was faded and stained, long losing the ability for anyone to recognize the true shape of the pattern it once displayed. The walls were just like the outside, bricks painted white, but the paint was beginning to fade, and the deep red ran through. Everything in the hallway felt dull and flat. Every color that I could see seemed half as true as it should have, and even the very air felt humid and oppressive. I could taste something in the old smell that permeated the hallway, though I couldn't place exactly what it was. The whole place felt wrong, and every nerve in my body seemed determined to throw me back into that elevator and to just go home. Whatever this place was, Sarah couldn't be here. There was no charm or character here. But she was here. Or she had been. I walked to the 3rd and final door on the left wall. A small placard next to the door said 406. I knocked a few times. No response. I hadn't expected a response. I knocked again anyway. I debated back and forth on whether I should call out to her. Before I could come to a solid conclusion on whether doing so was a good idea or not, I did so. I called her name. I knocked. I tried to talk to her through the door. She wasn't there. I could tell could feel that she wasn't there, but I still spoke to her all the same. Please, Sarah, open the door. I'll take you home, wherever we want home to be. But not here. Not in a place like this. So whatever it is that's keeping you here, whatever it is that's keeping you away from me, from talking to anyone, I just need you to open the door. I just need you to let me take you home. I just need you. Because I don't know how to do any of this shit without you. I'd curled up at the end of the hallway, resting against the far wall. I'd wait for Sarah until she came back. I knew she had to. I tried begging, I'd tried yelling, I'd tried kicking at the door a few times, nothing, no answer at all. Not from her, and not even from any of her neighbors. It was evening, just a breath away from 7. Not a person had come home from work. Not once did the elevator doors open. I'd heard it move, heard the telltale rattle and beep of buttons. I could see the little lights on top light up as it carried people from one floor to the next. First floor, second floor, third, fifth, sixth, but never the fourth. Not here. By 9, I'd given up on anyone coming back home. Maybe all the apartments were empty. Maybe there was something wrong with the 4th floor and everyone was evacuated. Maybe there was a gas leak and Sarah was taken to a hospital and she didn't want me to worry. Maybe I was breathing that gas in now. Maybe that was why the air felt so hot and wet. Maybe that was why it felt so hard to catch a deep breath. By 10, I watched as the 6 light bulbs that lit the hallway seemed to wax and wane in power. They struggled to maintain a consistent level of light, and these 6 separately pulsing lights dressed the walls in dancing shadow. It felt like the walls themselves were moving. They were practically breathing, pulsing in and out, joined with the ebb and flow of air. Deep breaths, sometimes, but mostly short staccato gasps. They felt eager, excited. But it was just a trick of the eyes. Just a trick of the eyes. I pulled my knees to my chest to keep myself still. I wasn't leaving without my sister. I couldn't. By 11, a soft scratching noise began to fill the hall. It came from behind the walls themselves, a sentient sound that paced the corridor. The movement was sporadic, following no pattern, and yet seemingly dictated by some logic I couldn't grasp. It felt alive. It felt like it was looking for something. Like it was looking for me? For Sarah? I knew there had to be some rational explanation. It was almost definitely rats. Except I knew it wasn't. The scratching followed along the wall before stopping for a moment right behind my head. I dug my fingernails into my palm. After the moment passed, the scratching continued onward on its patrol, but I couldn't release the tension. I needed to find Sarah. I needed to get her out of here. By midnight, my body was screaming at me to move. More than simply restless, it was something primal. My animal brain railed against the cage keeping it in place, screaming at me to go, to leave. Sarah was gone. Sarah wasn't coming back. This place was wrong, and whatever happened to her would happen to me. This place was wrong. Sarah was gone. Why was I here? Why hadn't I left? One of the light bulbs popped. The hallway was consumed a bit more by darkness, and my eyes seemed to drift closed. Sometime in the night, the deepest part of the night, I realized I was awake. I hadn't realized I was ever asleep, couldn't imagine how I was, but I knew that I had been and now I wasn't. This realization of consciousness, though, was overwhelming in that I knew I was awake, knew I had to be, but couldn't prove it. Because all around me was silence and darkness. My hands trailed across the hardwood ground beneath me, and I pushed myself up away from the wall I had propped my back against. My hand drifted to where my phone had been resting, but my fingers never made purchase with the device. I tried to shake fog from my mind and remember if I had moved it somewhere else. Both hands now traveled across the floor, desperately trying to find my cell phone. I couldn't find it. But something else felt wrong, too. I couldn't find my phone, but as I reached around in the darkness, I realized that it wasn't the only thing missing. My suitcase. It had been just a foot away to my right, resting in the corner. And it wasn't there. And neither was the corner of the hallway. The hallway to the building had been about 6 feet across, but I couldn't feel either wall any longer. I pressed myself up against the wall directly behind me, with it and the floor being my only tether to reality I could find. Silence. Darkness. But the wall, the floor were there. I could feel them. A voice in my head, that animal brain, screamed out a statement that I couldn't suppress. An important statement, but one that I didn't want to entertain. Because despite the terror mounting within me, that I was struggling to keep at bay, I hadn't yet lost touch with the moment. I still had something resembling a clear head, and I knew how fragile that could be right now. I pushed myself to my feet, pressing myself up against the wall. I began to slowly walk left, waving the corresponding arm out in front of me in hope that I would come to touch something, anything. And eventually, after what couldn't have been more than 10 feet, I found another wall. Encountering another surface was equal parts relief and alarm. It was something else to hold on to as real, another clue about the nature of where I was, but it also further fed that voice inside. I ignored it, and began to walk again, traveling along this wall now, trying to create a mental picture of where I could be. After a few more feet, I felt a raised section along the wall that eventually gave way to an opening. A door frame. A doorway. I reached out to find the other half of the doorway and noticed that there was no door attached. I could feel the hinges set into the wall, but they were there without purpose. I paused for a moment, trying to decide whether I should enter the other room or continue to explore the one I was already in. Before I could decide, the silence that had laid dormant in the room was disrupted. I could hear faint breathing coming from within the other room. It was without rhythm, instead coming in short, quiet gasps, like whatever or whoever it was fought for each breath it took. There was a ragged quality to the breaths as well, a gravel underneath the sound of air being inhaled and exhaled. In the pitch-black darkness, I struggled to tell how far it was away from me, desperately trying to keep my breathing as silent as possible. It was difficult. My heart was pounding, and my efforts to keep myself quiet only left my lungs screaming. But I had to listen. Had to hear those other breaths. Too many unknowns. But the soft breathing did seem to be getting louder. But then I realized, no, not louder. Simply closer. Closer. I silently slipped myself back to the left side of the door, back along the part of the wall I knew. I moved with purpose, careful balance at each step to prevent myself from making any noise at all. Eventually, I found the corner and pressed myself tight against it. I allowed myself one deep breath, as quietly as I could manage, to give my lungs a moment of relief. The breathing crossed the threshold. I could hear it again. It seemed to move slowly away from the wall, forward from the doorway into the great unknown space away from the walls that I found comfort in. The nebulous nothing that existed in the dark. Except now, there was definitely something there. Something breathing. But something that made no other sound at all. Eventually, I couldn't hear the breathing any longer, and again slowly shuffled back to the doorway. I didn't dare enter it yet, not sure of the room beyond that the breathing thing had come from. Not sure of the room I was in either, but I at least knew something. I knew the wall. I pushed myself past the doorframe, always listening for the breathing. Nothing. I continued my travel down the wall until, after a good few seconds more of walking, I found another corner. Another wall. Not seconds into traveling down this wall, my hand clattered against a protruding shape. The sound wasn't loud, but I froze. I waited. Could I hear the breathing? Maybe. Was it mine? I waited as silently as I could as time slid by at an unknowable rate. But eventually I found courage again, and slowly reached for the object I had found. I recognized it instantly. A doorknob. I could feel next to it the raise of a doorframe. I tried the knob slowly and silently, but it didn't turn more than a hair to either side. I tried to find any sort of lock on it, but couldn't. The other side? Had I been locked in somewhere? The voice inside me screamed again as I entertained thoughts I couldn't yet afford. I pushed it down again and found a small rhythm to the silent, shallow breaths I took. 3 walls so far. 3 walls. Would there only be 4? But traveling farther down the new wall I had found, it would take me closer to the breathing thing, to where it had gone. Fear and curiosity battled for a moment, and my feet carried me forward again. The wall was otherwise featureless, save for the door, and I continued along it for an unknown amount of time. The darkness made any sense of actual distance impossible. but it was a good handful of seconds before I came across another corner. Another wall. The fourth wall seemingly guiding me back to the wall where I had awoken. 4 walls. 4 corners. And not a large room at all. If I'd had to guess, I'd say the space was no larger than a small living room. I traveled along most of its walls fairly quickly considering the slow pace, and I was fairly certain that this wall would be no longer than the one I had found the open doorway in. But as my mental map began to fill in, I couldn't help but succumb for a moment to dread. The breathing thing in a room this size. I should have been able to hear it. As quiet as it was, were it still in the room, I should have heard it. Was there another room it went into? My journey along this last wall would take me directly into the path of where the breathing thing had walked. Was it there, now, perfectly quiet, just like me? Was it waiting? Was it gone? As I stood in that corner, I felt my eyes begin to sting with the formation of tears. I leaned my head back and did all I could to take deeper breaths as quietly as I could. I needed to keep myself in control. Whatever was happening, I couldn't get anywhere if I broke down. After a minute of getting myself back in order, I began to slowly travel down the final wall. I moved more slowly on this wall than the others, ears desperate to find any trace of sound, any possible hint that the thing was there in front of me. Nothing. And as I moved and moved, I found myself realizing that I must have passed the point the thing had walked toward. But there was no door. And there was nothing. Eventually, I found another corner. My original wall. But no breathing thing. As much as I dreaded it, I could only see one option left before me. I traveled down the first wall again and headed for the second, back to the empty doorframe, to the room from where the breathing had come. On the second wall, my fingers again found the slight raise of the doorframe. My hand drifted over and past it. And for the first time since I'd woken up, I couldn't resist a sharp inhale of breath. Actual audible noise. I regained myself after a minute, but my heart was pounding again and my brain was swimming with thoughts, none of which made any damn sense, but I knew what I was feeling. It didn't make any damn sense, but the doorframe wasn't empty any longer. There was a door. My hand traveled along the wooden surface that hadn't existed before, but I couldn't find a handle. I could use the raised parts of the doorframe to pick out where the door started and ended, but couldn't find a way to open it. I found the hinges. I could tell that something had been set into them. I wanted to scream out. I didn't understand. I wanted to scream anything at all. I wanted to pound on that door with everything I had left in me. But equal parts fear and caution held my hands. And suddenly the silence was shattered. I jumped back in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. The darkness was filled with the sound of someone, something, pounding on the door with all of their strength. And then the screams started. Human screams of terror and anguish. A girl. A girl screaming on the other side of the door. No words, but just guttural, primal howls. But I knew that voice. I'd know it anywhere. And abandoning all of my caution to all other thoughts, I threw myself back at the door. Sarah! I'd screamed her name as loud as I could, and as soon as I did, the pounding stopped. Silence. I replaced that silence with more screams of her name. Sarah! Sarah, I'm right here! Sarah! Between my desperate yells, my fist and foot colliding with the door in any attempt to make it give way, I could hear whimpers. Right on the other side of the door, I could hear Sarah crying, I'm right here, Sarah! I'm here! I'm not letting you go! I threw myself against the door again and again. It didn't give way in the slightest. I began to cry and scream, desperate to break through and get her out of here, us out of here. I kicked, my foot screamed in pain as I hit the door wrong, but I didn't stop. Nothing. After minutes of putting all of my force into the only thing separating us, I finally lost my strength. I collapsed into the door and weakly struck it again and again with a half-balled fist. You shouldn't have come, Eddie. You shouldn't have come. I choked back something mixed between a sob and a scream and shoved myself away from the door. I stood in the nothingness that dwelled in the middle of the mysterious room and readied myself. I hadn't come all this way just to give up. Not when Sarah was so close. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what was happening. I had so many questions. None of them mattered. All that mattered was finding the strength within me to save my family. I braced myself for another tackle towards the door. A singular breath exhaled onto the back of my neck. Every muscle in my body tensed and screamed as I threw myself forward, no longer an effort to take down the door, but merely a primal need to run, to hide. My left arm collided hard with the doorframe, but the rest of me continued forward, twisting and falling until I collapsed onto the ground a good 3 or so feet past the doorway. Despite all of the terror that flowed through me, it was this fact that truly collapsed any sense of reason I'd been holding on to. The door was gone. The door was gone. I was in the room. Something was behind me. The door was gone. And where was Sarah? Sarah! My panicked screams betrayed my quickly collapsing mental state as I groped in the darkness to all sides of me, reaching for the girl that I had come all this way for. All sense of protecting her, of rescuing her from whatever had happened to us, was gone. I screamed her name again and again as I crawled forward, looking for the comfort that she could provide. The room was a thin hallway, maybe 3 feet wide. The walls felt claustrophobic. Between screams, I gasped for breath, but the air in here was unnaturally warm, wet. I practically choked on it, but struggled through. I kept crawling forward, my arm wildly probing for something. For Sarah. For a way out. Tears streamed down onto the cold ground. My heart bruised the inside of my ribs. Nothing. Forward and nothing at all but more empty space. I screamed a guttural cry, and in the space of silence afterward, I heard the breathing again, behind me, close, louder, faster. I pivoted around onto my back and limply kicked out into the expanse of nothing I had just come from. My feet found purchase on nothing but the floor. My arms dragged me backward again. I was hysterical, still occasionally kicking out and trying to keep distance from whatever was out there. I pulled myself back as quickly as I could, unable to tear my focus away from whatever was approaching. No matter how quickly I crawled, it seemed to stay just as far away as before. I collided with something. Before I could turn around, a pair of arms reached out and embraced me. I wanted to scream out, but before I could, I heard a soft voice. "Oh, Eddie, you shouldn't have come." Sarah. I pushed myself into her and she held me tighter. I could recognize her smell, could feel her hair fall across my face and shoulder. She was cradling me into her chest. And for the faintest moment, I felt safe again. Sarah. Oh God, Sarah, you're here. You're here. She held me tight, her arms wrapped down and around my chest. My heart was still pounding, my mind still racing, but her being there had allowed me to regain myself. If even only a small part. "I'm here. You shouldn't have come, Eddie." And then the breathing again. Louder than it had been. And getting louder. Closer. It was in front of us. I tried to pull myself away from Sarah's embrace, but I couldn't move. She held me tightly. So tightly. As I struggled against her, her grip only tightened. "Sarah, let go! Something's coming. We need to run! We need to run!" I struggled against her again. And she again squeezed me tighter. I labored to take a breath as I felt my ribs begin to scream out at me in pain. "Sarah, stop!" The breathing only got closer and closer. And then it got lower. I could hear it, mere inches from my face. I could smell it. But it was the same as the air around me. Wet and oppressive and wrong. Thick. The air of its breath pressed again and again against my face, and I wanted to scream, wanted to cry out. I kicked my legs out in a futile effort to fight back against whatever stood before me, violently tried to shake myself loose from Sarah's suffocating grip, but she held tight and there was nothing for me to kick. Despite the breathing being so close, the thing that had been hunting me gave me no way to repel it. It wasn't there. My legs found nothing, but the breathing continued. It was in that moment that the animal brain finally took over and screamed again and again the fact that I had been trying so hard to bury. The simple fact that I had known since the moment I had awoken in the darkness, but couldn't dare to accept. I'm going to die. I felt a rib crack within me and pain flowed through me like fire. I'm going to die. A loud, scratching noise began to fill the room all around me. I'm going to die. A pair of lips kissed the top of my head softly, a kind gesture painted monstrous as my ribs continued to crack, as my quest to find any trace of air to breathe turned horribly futile, as the voice that spoke to me from the darkness changed. It was no longer my sister. It was something inhuman. You shouldn't have come, Eddie. I'm going to die. But I'm so glad you did.